Slavery, the practice of owning others, specifically blacks, was such a common word used daily without fail, but carried irreversible scars that would change America forever. Something was in motion, whose force was so strong it couldn't be stopped. This would later be known as the Abolition movement, a time of liberation and change for both blacks and whites. It all began in 1619 when the first African American slaves arrived in Virginia. Even early on, slaves received harsh punishments for the slightest things. Laziness was rewarded with whipping that would cause even the strongest man to break down and beg for mercy. Every simple mistake resulted in torture or sometimes even death. Black slaves were literally fighting every single day for their life. Their fate was already doomed and predetermined that they would die as white men's property. But in the coming years, this unfair and unjust torment wouldn't go unnoticed. In fact, it would cause a spark that would encourage black slaves and some unique white men to fight back.
Since the first African slaves were brought into Jamestown, Virginia to help the production of cash crops such as tobacco, America was brought into the struggles and conflicts that will be intertwined with its society and politics throughout the 17th and 18th century. Slave labor was used in a lot of areas. Slaves, they were not considered as human beings, but as properties that can be humiliated, punished, harmed, and even undignified.
Things started to finally pick up in terms of change. In 1775, a certain society that was against slavery in every way was founded by Pennsylvania Quakers. They were known as the Society for the Relief of Free Negroes. Even being immersed in a pro-slavery land didn't stop them from meeting. They met once, in 1775, the same year they were founded.
This group of Quakers never really did accomplish much of anything, but the fact that this was sort of the first sign of the possible end of slavery was kind of like a lighthouse for people looking for hope.
A period emerged from 1777 to 1804 where northern states would start to take a stance against slavery and began to gradually pass abolition laws. But this was only the beginning. America is still a newly founded country, meaning they are still working out the kinks in the Constitution. One of those kinks was slavery. This major problem was resolved when the Three-Fifths Compromise came to be. The compromise concluded that one slave would count as 3/5 of a person. The issue of how to include slaves into the population count was now resolved. In the same year, the Northwest Ordinance banned slavery in the Northwest Territory.
Abolition still wasn't widely supported even in the North. Slavery was the key essential in the economy at this time. The cheap labor made a huge amount of money, not only for people of the South, but the people of the North as well. And so many of the people in the North would claim to be against slavery, but they really didn't try to change anything because of their economic advantages from it.
A new anti-slavery society was introduced in 1794. It was the first national society against slavery. Its convenient title was the American Convention for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery. This mini group was far from long-lasting, but it was still a step towards a greater goal: the end of slavery. 6 years later, a man by the name of Gabriel Prosser, an enslaved African-American blacksmith, grabs the undivided attention of Virginia, more specifically Richmond, Virginia. Gabriel organizes a slave revolt intending to march on Richmond. The conspiracy is uncovered, and Prosser and a number of the rebels are hanged. Finally, a single man, a single slave, takes a stand for what he believes is right. Sadly, this courageous act ends in his life and consequently tightens Virginia's slave laws. A step backward in the abolition movement was made.
The effectiveness of this revolt during the time period and others like it was minimum to none at all. Although they did make a statement for the abolition of slavery, ultimately all they did were become martyrs for their cause and increase the difficulty of their fellow slaves.
A huge leap for slaves was made. January 1st, 1808. Congress bans the importation of slaves from Africa. But more obstacles were sure to come. In comes the year 1822, an obstacle. Denmark V.C., an enslaved African-American carpenter who had purchased his freedom, plans a slave revolt with the intent to lay siege on Charleston, South Carolina. The plot is discovered, and V.C. and 34 co-conspirators are hanged. Another revolt to end slavery ended in disaster and many deaths. The death toll involved in the abolition movement never stopped increasing in numbers. Almost 10 years later, America was faced with a gigantic problem: slave rebellions. In 1831, Nat Turner, an enslaved African-American preacher, leads the most significant slave uprising in American history. He and his band of followers launch a short, bloody rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia. The militia quells the rebellion, and Turner is eventually hanged. As a consequence, Virginia institutes much stricter slave laws once again. In 30 short years, 3 different rebellions with 3 different leaders all occurred with the same purpose and the same result: death and no closer to freedom. In the same year, an important man would appear who would change the course of the movement altogether. But his story doesn't start here. William Lloyd Garrison was born on December 10, 1805, in Massachusetts, and spent most of his schooling at a Baptist deacon after his mother could no longer provide for him without having his father around who had left him. This speed bump doesn't stop or hinder him from publishing The Liberator, a weekly paper that advocates the complete abolition of slavery in the year of 1831, or from founding the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833. Between the years of 1831 and 1833, William Lloyd Garrison's Thought on African Colonization was published. It marked a turning point of anti-slavery against colonization. These 3 contributions to the abolition movement led Garrison to become one of the most famous and most radical figures in the abolition movement.
Our country is the world, and our countrymen is mankind. This was the motto for William Paper the Liberator. In his paper, he talked a lot about his beliefs, including the immediate emancipation of the slave, and how he believed that the slaves, once freed, could assimilate into American culture because in his eyes they were Americans as well. This belief was very unpopular among the North, which made him a really radical abolitionist during this time period.
But Garrison isn't the only person who significantly helps the progress of the abolition movement. In comes Elijah Lovejoy. Elijah was born on November 9, 1802, to a reverend and ends up becoming a minister himself in the year of 1833. Beginning to show an interest in abolitionist sentiments, Elijah became very unpopular in the slave state, Missouri, for the publishing of these ideals and narrowly escaped mobs on a number of occasions. When the violence continued, Lovejoy uprooted and moved to Alton, Illinois, where he opened up the paper The Observer in 1836. At first, the people of Alton were only mildly agitated by Lovejoy's abolitionist sentiments, but as his opinions became more voiced and he became bolder in his action, such as creating a petition to send to state legislator and creating an abolitionist society, the townspeople became increasingly violent. Mobs of townspeople destroyed Lovejoy's presses, and on November 7, 1837, Lovejoy died, trying to protect a 4th press in Alton, Illinois.
Elijah Lovejoy's work for abolition represented a step towards a unified front against slavery. The spread of his opinions throughout the area not only solidified people's sympathies for the Southern workers, but also enabled a community of abolitionists to emerge. The use of his paper and his constant petitioning of state legislature to change all represented major turning points in the abolitionist movement.
Another important man appears who would also encourage many slaves across the country to break free from their chains. His name was Frederick Douglass. Born as the illegitimate son of a slave woman and a white man, Frederick Douglass would spend 20 years in slavery before escaping to Massachusetts with his wife on September 3, 1838. Douglass's first speech was made at the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society's annual convention. This was his first contribution to the movement. Douglass would publish his first autobiography, Narrative of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, in 1845. This book gave people the insight they needed to fully know and understand what it takes to be a slave, and more importantly, a free slave. Upon his return to the States, Douglass published his most famous abolitionist newspaper, the North Star. It got its name because slaves escaping at night followed the North Star in the sky to freedom. On the brink of civil war, Frederick Douglass was one of the most famous black men in the States and earned himself a controversial reputation. Despite his personal political feelings, he remained very influential in regards to the Emancipation Proclamation, being passed because of his dedication to the termination of slavery. Douglass even ended up holding position of power as the first black vice presidential candidate and upheld many political positions. His life was literally dedicated to the cause of freedom to all slaves.
Frederick Douglass denounced a lot of the popular beliefs at this time, such as William Lloyd Garrison's beliefs. Garrison was very radical in the way he thought, and Frederick Douglass believed that the Union should not be separated into North and South because the slaves of the South would be isolated. He also believed that the Constitution was pro-slavery. Sometimes he believed that it would even be leading towards emancipation for the slaves.
Douglass wasn't alone. Sojourner Truth was also a brother in combat, as she was also an ex-slave who fought for slavery's end. Truth escaped to the North, which opened up a door to her career of ending slavery. Truth joined the Northampton Association of Education and Industry in Massachusetts, where she met Garrison Douglass. In 1846, the community was disbanded, but Truth's career had just started. During the Civil War, Truth dedicated her time to persuade freed slaves to recruit to the Union Army. This act was miraculously helpful in persuading fellow slaves and free slaves to fight for their rights.
She was the one that was separated from her family when she was only a little girl. She was the one that was forced to leave the man that she loved, and she was the one that decided to escape for her freedom and rights. And she was the first black woman to successfully challenge a white man in court to bring her child back. In 1843, Isabella Banfree officially changed her name to Sojourner Truth, and from that point on, she never stopped fighting for her beliefs of equal rights and freedom.
In 1846, the Wilmot Proviso, introduced by Democratic Representative David Wilmot of Pennsylvania, attempts to ban slavery in territory gained in the Mexican War. The proviso is blocked by Southerners, but continues to inflame the debate over slavery. A few years later, in 1849, Harriet Tubman escapes from slavery and becomes one of the most effective and celebrated leaders of the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad became a huge aspect of abolitionism. It was a network of routes and safe houses that led many slaves to freedom in the North. The term is also applied to the abolitionists, both black and white, free and enslaved, who aided the fugitives. Harriet Tubman, one of the main abolitionists who helped many slaves to freedom, basically became the spokesperson of what the Underground Railroad stood for: liberation.
Harriet Tubman was really an extraordinary person. She made at least 19 trips back to the South to help others, and because of this, by the year 1856, the reward for her capture would have been $40,000. And even after her work with the Underground Railroad, she went to work for the Union during the Civil War as a cook, a nurse, and even a spy.
Even in 1850, the debate continues on whether the territory gained in the Mexican War should be open to slavery is decided in the Compromise of 1850. California is admitted as a free state. Utah and New Mexico territories are left to be decided by popular sovereignty, and the slave trade in Washington, D.C. is prohibited. It also establishes a much stricter fugitive slave law than the original passed in 1793. The debate is closed for now. In 1852, an important novel to the abolitionist movement is created. The novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, is published. It becomes one of the most influential works to stir anti-slavery sentiments. More territorial decisions are made in the year of 1854. The legislation repeals the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and renews tensions between anti- and pro-slavery factions. The friction only grows stronger when in 1857, the Dred Scott case holds that Congress does not have the right to ban slavery in states, and furthermore, that slaves are not citizens. Finally, the man of the hour, Abraham Lincoln. His undying hate for the slave system is made clear in 1858 in his House Divided speech, which condemned slavery. Thanks to the devotion of President Lincoln and many others, the abolition movement comes to a close after the Civil War with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, declaring that all persons held as slaves within the Confederate state are and henceforward shall be free. The end of the movement is reinforced in 1865 when the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery throughout the U.S. On June 19, 1865, slavery in the U.S. effectively ended when 250,000 slaves in Texas finally received the news that the Civil War had ended 2 months earlier. The horrendous act of slavery is gone, for as the great man once said, "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color. God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren."